Skethra had never smelled anything like a human station before. It hit him the moment the docking seal cracked open and the recycled air of Outpost Calder 9 pushed its way into the entry corridor of the Vrethkai ship. A strange mix of synthetic food, metal, something faintly chemical, and underneath all of it, something warm and organic that he could not quite name. He wrinkled his nose and looked back at Warden Vorath, who stood tall and unhurried behind him, dressed in the deep charcoal ceremonial coat of a senior Vrethkai diplomat. Vorath was broad even by Vrethkai standards, with the silver-streaked mane of someone who had seen 4 decades of active service, and decided that none of it was worth rushing over. "It smells strange," Skethra said. "Most things do, the first time," Vorath replied, and stepped past him into the station corridor without another word. Skethra followed, pulling himself upright and reminding himself that he was here as an observer. That was what his elders called it, a witness tour, a formal right given to young Vrethkai who were old enough to travel, but not yet old enough to serve. The idea was simple. Go out into the galaxy, see the species that filled it, and understand your place among them. Understand what it meant to be Vrethkai, to be at the top of the dominance codex, to be the thing that other creatures instinctively stepped back from when you walked into a room. He had been looking forward to it for years. The station itself was large, a mid-class deep space trading post, built in the flat utilitarian style that humans seem to prefer. All gray corridors and bright overhead lighting, and signs posted at every junction in at least 6 different scripts. It was busy without being chaotic, full of species moving between docking bays and market floors and administrative offices, and Skethra watched them all with the careful interest of someone who had grown up studying the codex, rankings, and could now finally put faces to classifications. He spotted a pair of Drassy traders near a cargo checkpoint. Long-necked, slow-moving, Tier 4 on the codex, known mostly for their chemistry and their patience, and a cluster of Gethland workers loading supply crates into a freight elevator, short and heavily built, Tier 5, unremarkable. And then, moving through the crowd with a kind of easy authority that he did not expect, the humans. There were more of them here than he had anticipated. They were the ones running the station after all, which meant they were everywhere, behind service desks and walking patrol routes and talking into comm units with the slightly distracted expression of people managing 6 things at once. He had seen images of humans before, in educational files and codex supplementary materials, but images did not fully prepare him for the reality of how they moved. They were so small, not just in height, though most of them came only to his shoulder, but in everything. Their arms were thin, their hands were oddly flat and fingered, their faces had almost no natural armor on them at all, just bare skin, 2 small eyes, a nose that could not possibly detect much of anything. They looked, to Skethra's eyes, like something that should not have made it very far in any serious ecosystem, and yet they walked like they owned the corridor, not aggressively, not with the deliberate posture display that Vrethkai used to signal dominance, just with a kind of relaxed, forward-leaning ease, like nothing in the immediate environment had registered as a threat worth adjusting for. Skethra found that faintly strange. The Vrethkai delegation had been assigned an official station escort for the duration of their visit. Warden Vorath had explained this in advance, some diplomatic courtesy that the human administrators provided for all high-tier visitors, and she was waiting for them at the end of the corridor. Docking corridor. A human female, dressed in the gray and black uniform of Calder 9 station security, standing with her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She was not tall, not even by human standards, Skethra guessed, with short dark hair and a face that was calm, in the particular way of someone who was paying attention without showing it. There were faint marks along her jaw, and one forearm that he recognized from codex files as scar tissue. Old injuries healed over, and she wore them the way Vrethkai elders wore rank markings, which he found oddly confusing. "Warden Vorath," she said, inclining her head with the correct degree of formal respect. She had clearly been briefed. "I'm Sergeant Mara Voss, Station Security. I'll be your escort for the duration of the treaty proceedings. If you need anything during your time on Calder 9, I'm your contact." Vorath returned the greeting in kind and introduced Skethra as an observing junior, acknowledged with a brief nod in his direction. Her eyes moved over him once, taking in his height, his mane, the ceremonial arm guards he had insisted on wearing because he wanted to look appropriate. And then she moved on without any particular reaction. He was used to being looked at with more reaction than that. They moved through the station together, Voss walking slightly ahead, guiding them through the main corridor network toward the administrative quarter where the treaty signing would take place. She walked fast for a human, with a stride that was short but very efficient, and she navigated the crowded corridors without slowing down, slipping through gaps in foot traffic with a precision that was almost mechanical. She spoke when she needed to, pointed out relevant junctions, answered Vorath's logistical questions in short, accurate sentences, and otherwise stayed quiet. Skethra watched her. He was not sure why he kept watching her. Anything interesting. She was just walking and talking and doing her job. But something about the way she moved nagged at him in a way he could not articulate, like a sound just at the edge of hearing, present but not quite identifiable. He wrote it off as novelty. He had simply never been near a human before, and everything about them was unfamiliar enough to seem notable for now. Once the treaty signing was done and the diplomatic formalities were out of the way, he would have time to observe more of the station and its crew, and by the end of the visit he was sure the novelty would have faded entirely, and he would be ready to go home and report back to his tutors that he had confirmed what everyone already knew. Humans were soft, unremarkable, and no more threatening than the recycled air that smelled faintly of something warm and alive. The treaty room was on the upper administrative deck, clean, well lit, fitted with a long oval table and seating for 8 species. The treaty itself concerned transit rights through a contested corridor near the Grell border, and while Skethra had only a basic grasp of the political details, he understood enough to know that it was considered a significant agreement. Several senior officials were already seated when they arrived, and the atmosphere was the particular kind of careful and formal that large agreements always seem to produce. Voss positioned herself near the door, standing easy, scanning the room once with those quiet eyes, and then settling into stillness. Skethra took his observer's seat against the wall and opened his personal log to make notes, and the treaty proceedings began, and for the next several hours, everything was exactly as diplomatic and uneventful as everyone expected it to be. The lights went out just after the 4th signature was placed on the document. Not a flicker, not a system warning, just a sudden and total darkness across the entire deck, followed by the low resonant tone of the emergency seal engaging on every door in the corridor outside. Skethra went still. Voss had already moved. The darkness lasted exactly 2 seconds before the emergency lighting kicked in. Thin red strips running along the base of the walls. Enough to see shapes, but not details. Enough to turn everything in the room into shadows and edges. Skethra's first instinct was to stand. His second, faster instinct was to look for Vorath. But before either of those things fully completed, Warden Vorath was already beside him, one large hand pressing him firmly back into his seat, with a grip that communicated very clearly that this was not a moment for the young to make decisions. "Stay low, and stay behind me," Vorath said quietly, and the quietness of it was more serious than any shout would have been. The treaty officials were moving, some toward the back of the room, some reaching for comm units, one of the Drossi representatives making a low distress sound in the dark. Voss had crossed the room in the same moment the lights died, placing herself between the main door and the table, her sidearm drawn, her eyes on the door seal. Then the seal disengaged from the outside. It was not supposed to be able to do that. The door opened, and the first of them came through fast and low, a Grell, dressed in dark tactical gear, with a pulse blade already active in his right hand, the blade throwing a thin blue light across the floor. Then a second one behind him, and a third, and they kept coming until there were 6 of them in the corridor just beyond the doorway, spreading to cover the angles the way trained fighters did, professionals, people who had done this before and expected it to be straightforward. Vorath pulled Skethra behind a heavy equipment panel along the side wall. It was solid enough to provide cover, and there was a gap between the panel and the wall mount, narrow, maybe the width of 2 fingers, and Skethra pressed himself against it and looked through without thinking, because he was 17 years old and frightened, and his body made the decision before his brain did. What he saw through that gap stayed with him for the rest of his life. Voss had not retreated to the back of the room with the officials. She was standing 4 steps inside the corridor, between the 6 armed Grell and the treaty room. In the red emergency light, absolutely still. The lead Grell said something to her in his own language. Skethra did not speak Grell, but the tone was universal. Move aside, this does not need to include you. You cannot win this. Voss did not move aside. The lead Grell took 1 step forward and swung the pulse blade in a fast horizontal arc. It was meant as a warning strike, the kind designed to frighten rather than kill. But Voss stepped into it instead of back, and the blade caught her across the left forearm and opened the skin immediately. A deep, clean cut that began bleeding the moment it landed, red and visible even in the dim light. Stopped. Because what he expected, what every piece of biological logic told him should happen, was that she would pull back, that the pain and the blood and the sight of 6 armed opponents would trigger the retreat response that every sensible creature had, that she would create distance and call for support and wait for better odds. She did none of those things. She used the Grell's extended arm, the one that had just cut her, as a handle. Her right hand closed around his wrist before the blade finished its arc, and she turned her whole body into the motion, not away from him, but through him, and the Grell went down onto the corridor floor with a sound like something structural giving way, and he did not get back up. The second one moved immediately. They were trained enough not to freeze, and he was fast, covering the distance between them in less than a second, going for her center mass. She dropped her shoulder, took the impact differently than he expected, and redirected it, and he hit the wall instead of her, and she helped him hit the wall in a way that ended his involvement in the situation entirely. Third and fourth came together, coordinated, the smart approach, targeting both sides at once. Voss moved left, putting the third between herself and the fourth, and the pulse blade that the fourth swung caught the third across the shoulder instead of her, which created a problem for both of them and an advantage for no one except Voss, who used the next 1.5 seconds with a kind of absolute economy that Skethra had no framework for. She was bleeding the whole time. The cut on her forearm was not a small one, and it did not close on its own, and the blood was running down her hand and dripping from her fingers, and she moved like it was not happening, like her body had simply not registered it as relevant information, like pain was a message she had received and set aside to deal with later. The fifth Grell had a different weapon, a short-range suppression device, something that sent out a concussive pulse. He fired it, and the shockwave hit Voss directly, and she stumbled, one knee going down, and for a fraction of a second, Skethra thought it was over. She was back up before the Grell had taken 2 steps toward her. The way she came up was not the way something gets up when it is recovering. It was the way something gets up when it was waiting for you to come closer. and the fifth Grell apparently understood this approximately 1 second too late. The sixth one ran. He got 4 steps down the side corridor before Voss made a single decision that Skethra would later describe in his formal report as tactically unnecessary but apparently instinctive. And the sixth Grell did not reach the end of the corridor. 11 seconds. Skethra counted back through it afterward, trying to find places where it could have gone differently. And the number kept coming out the same. 11 seconds from the first strike to the last. 6 trained armed fighters, and 1 bleeding human in a red-lit corridor. And at the end of it, only one of them was standing. Voss stood in the corridor for a moment, breathing. Not gasping, just breathing. Steady and deliberate. And she looked at her left arm once, the way someone looks at a bill they expected and are not happy about. And then she reached up and clicked the comm unit on her collar. "Corridor B7 is clear," she said. And her voice was the same voice she had used all day. The same flat professional tone she had used to tell them about junction markers and administrative schedules. "I need a medic and a cleanup crew. Medic first." Then she turned back toward the treaty room, and her eyes found the gap in the equipment panel where Skethra was pressed against the wall. And for one moment, she looked directly at him through it. Pride. Not with aggression. Not with any of the things he might have expected. Just with the same calm attention she had given everything else today. Then she looked away and went back to watching the corridor. Skethra did not move for a long time after that. He was not sure his legs would have cooperated if he tried. Vorath put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, and the silence between them was the kind that meant the elder had seen something worth being silent about. And Skethra pressed his back against the equipment panel and stared at the red-lit ceiling, and tried to organize what he had just watched into something that fit inside any category he had been taught. He could not do it. The blood on the corridor floor was still spreading in a slow, dark pool when the medic team arrived, and Voss waved them toward her arm with the mild impatience of someone who had more important things to deal with first, and was only allowing the interruption because it was technically required. Skethra watched her through the gap and said nothing, and thought nothing that was fully formed yet. He just kept counting to 11. The ship left Outpost Calder 9 6 hours after the corridor was cleared. The treaty had been completed, all signatures placed, all seals confirmed, the whole purpose of the visit technically fulfilled, and the Vrethkai delegation moved through their departure procedures with the efficient quietness of people who had decided, without discussing it, that they were ready to leave. Voss escorted them to the docking corridor herself, her left arm wrapped in a clean white medical dressing from wrist to elbow, her face carrying a new addition in the form of a dark bruise spreading from below her left eye toward her jaw. The medics had apparently confirmed a fracture of the orbital bone, and she had apparently told them she would address it after departure processing was complete. She walked them to the docking seal the same way she had walked them everywhere else, slightly ahead, efficient stride, watching the corridor, and at the seal, she stopped and gave the same formal farewell that she had given the opening greeting, correct in every detail, nothing added and nothing missing. Vorath thanked her with genuine gravity. She nodded once, said she hoped the visit had been productive, and walked back the way she came without looking behind her. Skethra watched her go until she turned the corner. He did not speak on the journey back through the docking tunnel, or during the seal check, or through the first hour of transit away from the station. He sat in the junior observer's seat in the main cabin, with his personal log open in his lap, and not a single entry made in it, staring at the wall in the particular way of someone whose brain is working very hard on something it does not have the right tools for. Vorath left him alone until the station was well behind them. Then he came and sat in the seat across from Skethra, and set a cup of warm travel broth on the table between them, which was a Vrethkai elder's way of saying that a conversation was about to happen, and it was going to be an honest one. Skethra picked up the cup, because it would have been wrong not to. "Ask your questions," Vorath said. Skethra looked at the table and thought about where to start. There were many places, and he picked the one that had been loudest in his head since the corridor. "Why didn't she stop when she bled?" he said. Vorath did not answer immediately. He had the patience of someone who understood that a quick answer to a real question was usually less useful than a slow one. "What do you mean by stop?" Vorath asked. "When the first one cut her," Skethra said, and he kept his voice even, because he had been trained to keep his voice even, but it was not easy right now. She was bleeding before the fight was even 30 seconds old, a real cut, deep, continuous. I have seen Vrethkai warriors stand down from training bouts for less than that. Changed something. It should have been a signal to reassess, to create distance, to do something other than keep going forward. "What does blood mean to you?" Vorath asked. Skethra looked at him. "It means something is wrong. It means the body is losing something it cannot easily replace. It means the situation has exceeded the margin you planned for, and you should adjust your position." "Yes," Vorath said, "that is what it means to us." He paused. "It is not what it means to them." Skethra waited. Vorath turned the cup in his hands and looked at the wall the same way Skethra had been looking at it, and when he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of someone reciting something they had spent a long time deciding to say. "Humans evolved on a planet called Earth," he said. "You know this from your codex files." Skethra nodded. "The files describe it as a Class 3 biosphere, moderate threat rating, nothing exceptional." He stopped. "Files are wrong." Skethra said nothing. Earth's threat rating was assessed based on a survey of its largest predators and its most common pathogens, Vorath said, which is the standard methodology, and by that methodology it scores moderate. But that methodology does not ask the right question. He set down his cup. The right question is not, what does this planet have that can kill? The right question is, what did this planet produce that survived all of it for long enough to build spaceships? Humans survived it, Skethra said slowly. Humans did not just survive it, Vorath said. They survived it without the things that every other apex species used to do the same. They did not have our size or our natural armor or our threat display capability. They did not have the chemical defense systems of the Drasi or the pack coordination instincts of the Gethlan. They were, by most physical measurements, exactly as fragile as the codex files. Say, LP. Then how? Skethra said. Because of what happened to them every time something on that planet tried to kill them, Vorath said. It tried very often. The predators were faster, the pathogens were everywhere, the climate was unstable, the food competition was severe, and every time something hurt a human badly enough that a sensible creature would have withdrawn from the situation, the humans who withdrew died. He let that sit for a moment. And the humans who did not withdraw sometimes also died, but sometimes they did not. And over a very long time what survived was the ones who stayed, the ones who pushed through the pain signal, the ones who decided that the correct response to being hurt was to finish what they had started. Skethra thought about the corridor, about the pulse blade arc, and the cut, and the zero change in her momentum. Pain became a forward signal, he said. Worse than that, Vorath said. Pain became an anger signal. There is something in their biochemistry, a stress response cascade that most species use to trigger retreat. In humans, it does the opposite. It narrows their focus. It increases their physical output. It removes the hesitation that most creatures experience when the situation exceeds their plan. He looked at Skethra directly. When something hurts a human, it does not make them want to be somewhere else. It makes them want to ensure that the thing that hurt them cannot do it again. Skethra sat with that for a long time. He thought about how Voss had looked through the gap in the equipment panel. Not proud, not aggressive, just present and calm and done. And he thought about the 6 Grell on the floor of the corridor, and the way she had clicked her comm and asked for a medic second. She asked for the cleanup crew first, he said quietly. Because the corridor was still a potential threat environment, Vorath said. A medic was a personal need. Cleanup crew was a professional requirement. She prioritized in order. With a fractured face and a deep arm wound? Yes. Skethra stared at the table. How long have we known this about them? Vorath was quiet for a moment. That told Skethra the answer, before the words came. Long enough that it is no longer considered useful to document formally, he said. The elder species agreed, in a fairly quiet consensus, that classifying humans accurately would cause more problems than leaving the codex as it is. Why? Because the accurate classification does not fit any existing category, Vorath said, and because the species who had tried to treat humans as prey found the reclassification conversation considerably more difficult after the fact than before it. Skethra looked up at him. How many species made that mistake? Vorath picked up his cup again and said nothing, which was itself an answer. Skethra wrote 3 words in his personal log that night and stared at them for a long time before he closed it. The words were, wrong tier, wrong category. He did not know yet what the right category was, but he knew with absolute certainty that Tier 6 prey was not it, and that somewhere in the Galactic Species Codex Council there was a very large error that had been sitting quietly for a very long time. He was going to find out exactly how long. The formal petition took Skethra 4 days to write. He was not a slow writer. His tutors had always said he was precise, which was the Vrethkai academic way of saying that he took longer than most to say things, but that when he said them, they were worth reading. And he was precise about this, careful about every word, because he understood that what he was submitting was not a complaint, or an observation, or a casual note. It was a formal request to the Galactic Species Codex Council to re-examine one of its oldest and most settled classifications. He included everything, his own account of the corridor, written in the plain factual language that formal petitions required. Timeline, attacker count, duration of engagement, injury state of the human combatant at the start and end of the engagement. He included the station security footage that Calder 9's administrator had provided upon request. Because Skethra had asked for it the same morning they departed, administrator had approved it without apparent surprise, as if the request were routine. He included 2 pages of comparative analysis against known Vrethkai combat performance benchmarks, which he wrote carefully and without exaggeration, and which made uncomfortable reading when laid against the 11-second figure. He submitted it to the Codex Council through the standard academic petition channel, and then he went back to his studies and waited. The first response came in 9 days. It was a form letter. The kind of form letter that had clearly been generated by someone who had read the subject line and not the content. It thanked him for his submission, noted that the Galactic Species Codex was reviewed on a regular cycle, acknowledged receipt of his supporting materials, and directed him to a public database of current species classifications for reference, while his petition was under consideration. There was a small stamp at the bottom, indicating it had been handled by the office of the junior classification clerk. Skethra read it twice, put it down, and began drafting a follow-up. The follow-up was longer than the original petition, and considerably less polite in tone, though still technically within the boundaries of formal academic language. It pointed out that the supporting footage alone represented a data point that did not fit any existing Tier 6 behavioral profile, that the combat efficiency ratio demonstrated in the engagement exceeded documented Tier 3 benchmarks in 3 separate categories, and that the Council's obligation under its own charter included an active duty to correct known classification errors, not simply to acknowledge their existence. He submitted the follow-up and waited. The second response was faster. It came from an actual named individual at the Council, a mid-rank assessor named Pelveth, whose title was Associate Reviewer of Biological Classifications, Non-Priority. caseload, which told Skethra everything he needed to know about where his petition had been filed. Pelveth's response was polite, thorough, and entirely useless. It explained that the Tier 6 classification for Homo sapiens was based on a comprehensive survey conducted 211 years ago, that the survey methodology had been reviewed twice since and found to be sound, and that while the incident described in the petition was notable, single event outliers were not considered sufficient basis for a classification review under Council guidelines. It also, in a final paragraph that Skethra suspected Pelveth had added with some personal satisfaction, noted that combat performance in extreme stress situations could not be assumed to represent species-wide capability, and that the subject of the incident was a professional security officer, which was a self-selected high-performance subsection of the human population, and therefore, statistically, unrepresentative. Skethra read that final paragraph 3 times. Then he shared the petition and both responses on the open academic network used by young scholars across 4 species, because he was 17 years old and had not yet learned to be strategic about his frustrations. And within 48 hours, the thread had been seen by 11,000 people, and the headline that circulated on the interstellar news feeds was, "Young Vrethkai Cub, terrified by soft biped, files official complaint." The comments were not kind. Several of them were funny, in the way that things are funny when they are at someone else's expense. There were jokes about whether the cub had perhaps confused a human with a Vrethkai in poor lighting, jokes about the rigorous standards of the Codex being challenged by someone who had not yet finished his first academic year, jokes about whether Tier 6 prey would now require a formal safety warning before approaching young Vrethkai. Observers, Skethra, read all of them and said nothing publicly. But the thread also reached, among its 11,000 viewers, a Drossi scholar named Ovaleth, who held the chair of Comparative Species Behavioral Analysis at the Interstellar Institute of Biological Sciences, and had been doing this work for 61 years, and had reviewed more species classification data than any living non-human academic in the Council's own records. Ovaleth did not comment on the thread. She downloaded the station footage that Skethra had attached to his original petition, and she watched it in her office at the Institute, alone, with the kind of attention that 61 years of careful work had given her. She watched it once at normal speed, and then she watched it again at 1/4 speed, and then she sat very still for a while, and then she began pulling records. She pulled every archived human conflict document in the Council's database: engagements, survival events, medical anomaly reports, first contact incident files from the early expansion period. There were more of them than she expected, and several of them had classification flags on them, indicating that they had been reviewed and deemed non-representative, which she noted without comment, and continued pulling. She ran all of it through the behavioral modeling framework she had developed and refined over 6 decades, a system that she had used to successfully analyze 43 species, and that had never failed to produce a coherent output. It failed on the human dataset. Not partially, not in one category or one subcategory. It produced incoherent outputs across the primary threat response modeling, the pain stimulus behavior mapping, and the social cooperation under duress analysis. Because the human data did not behave the way any of the 43 previous datasets had behaved, and the model had not been built with the assumption that it might need to accommodate what the human data was showing. Ovaleth rebuilt the relevant model sections twice to rule out error. The outputs were the same both times. She wrote her report over 7 days, and it was 47 pages long, which was unusual for her. Her standard reports averaged 19 pages, and when it was finished, she submitted it directly to the full council under the Emergency Classification Review Protocol that she had never used before in 61 years, because she had never before encountered a situation that she believed required it. The council received it on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the thread about the frightened cub had been quietly removed from the interstellar news feeds. By Friday, 3 council members had personally contacted Ovalith to ask questions that confirmed they had read all 47 pages. The summary of the report was 3 sentences long. It read, "Humanity has been misclassified for 200 years. They are not prey. They are something we do not currently have a category for." Skethra did not see the report for another 3 weeks, when Vorath forwarded it to him without comment. He read the summary first, then the full 47 pages, then sat in his study room for a long time. He had been right. He was not sure whether that felt good or not. He decided it mostly did not feel like anything except large, the way true things sometimes feel when you finally have someone else say them out loud in a language the world is required to listen to. He wrote one line in his personal log that night. It said, "The Codex Council is no longer laughing." 14 years passed between the corridor and the lecture hall. In those 14 years, Skethra completed his academic certification, served 2 tours as a junior diplomatic attaché on vessels operating near the human-administered border sectors, received his warden commission at age 26, which was considered young even by the standards of a generation that had started advancing people faster than the one before it, and accumulated enough field time and formal commendations that when the HFY War Academy invited him to deliver a guest lecture to the 3rd-year cadet cohort, the invitation was not a courtesy, it was recognition. The academy was on the northern continent of the HFY homeworld, built into the side of a mountain range that had been considered sacred for long enough that the architecture had absorbed the attitude. Everything was stone and gravity, and the understanding that the world had been here before you and would be hereafter. Lecture hall could seat 300, and it was full when Skethra walked in. Because the title of the lecture had been circulated in advance, and the cadets had talked about it enough that the 3rd-year cohort had invited some of the 2nd years, and nobody in the administrative office had found a reason to stop them. Skethra was 31 years old, and he walked to the front of the hall with the unhurried stride of someone who had spent years around a species that moved like they owned corridors. And he stood behind the speaker's position and looked at 300 young HFY faces looking back at him. He did not use notes. "I want to tell you about 11 seconds, he said. He told them about Outpost Calder 9, the trading station, the treaty, the lights going out. He told it plainly, without embellishment, the way he had learned to tell it over years of being asked about it, in contexts ranging from formal academic reviews to late-night conversations. With crew members on long transit voyages, he had found that plain was always more effective than dramatic, because the facts were already dramatic on their own, and anything added to them only made the audience trust them less. He described Sergeant Mara Voss the way he had described her in his personal log the first time he wrote about her. Small, calm, unremarkable, moving through a crowd with that odd coiled-forward ease that he had noticed and not known how to name. He described the corridor, the 6 grell, the darkness, the red light. He described the cut. He watched the hall as he described the cut, the moment the pulse blade opened her forearm, and the blood started, and she did not stop, and he could see the cadets responding to it the way he had responded to it, the subtle shift in posture that meant the brain was flagging something as wrong, as outside the expected pattern, as requiring additional processing. Description of the 11 seconds. He let it sit long enough that 2 cadets in the front row exchanged a look, which meant they were trying to find an explanation that fit what they had just heard inside a framework they had been given, and were not finding one. "I filed a petition to the Codex Council when I returned home," he said. "You may have seen the news coverage. The headlines were not favorable to me." He said it without bitterness, just as information. I was 17 and I had just watched something that I could not fit inside any category I had been taught. And the response of the galactic academic community was to make jokes about it, which is what communities do when they encounter information they do not want to reorganize their thinking around. He told them about Oveleth, about the 47-page report, about the model breaking, about the council reading it in silence. He told them what Vorath had told him on the ship, about Earth, about the long history of being hunted, and the thing that survived it. He told it more precisely now than Vorath had, because he had spent 14 years studying it, and he had access to Oveleth's full research, and the 6 additional papers that had followed it once the Council's reclassification had opened the door for honest inquiry. Every species that has ever achieved apex status in a competitive ecosystem, he said, did it through a process that the Dominance Codex accurately describes. You become large, or fast, or armored, or chemically defended, or cognitively superior, and you use that advantage to occupy the top of the food chain. And once you are there, your threat response system learns to recognize that position. When something challenges you, you assess and you display. And if the display is insufficient, you commit to the engagement. And if the engagement goes against you, you disengage. That is rational. That is what intelligence looks like when it is produced by. He paused. Humans were not produced by success, he said. They were produced by surviving failure, by being for hundreds of thousands of years, not the apex of their ecosystem, but somewhere in the middle of it, where everything larger and faster and better armed than them was a regular feature of daily existence. And the thing that their biology selected for, over all that time, was not the ability to win every fight. It was the inability to stop in the middle of one. The hall was very quiet. Their pain response does not trigger retreat, he said. It triggers focus. It narrows everything down to the immediate problem. And it removes the hesitation that most creatures have when the situation exceeds their original plan. When you hurt a human, you do not create distance between yourself and a threat. You create a human who has one thing on their mind. He let that land. I have worked alongside humans for 8 years of active service, he said. I have eaten with them and argued with them, and once watched a human engineer fix a failing reactor by hitting it in a specific location while using language I cannot translate in this setting. I have been in rooms where humans were afraid, and rooms where they were angry, and rooms where they were both at the same time, which is a combination I recommend experiencing only once and from a safe distance. There were a few sounds from the hall that were the Vrethkai equivalent of nervous laughter. Skethra did not smile, because he was not being funny. The Codex still does not have a category for them, he said. Oveleth's report created a working classification called Tier Unknown, which is a way of saying that we have a rigorous academic framework for understanding species, and humans do not fit inside it cleanly. They are not the strongest species in the known galaxy. They are not the fastest, or the most armored, or the most cognitively advanced. In every measurable dimension, he stopped. But they are the only species in the Council's full database for which the behavioral record shows, repeatedly, across thousands of years of documented conflict, that the standard method of ending a fight with them does not work. He looked out at 300 quiet faces. The standard method of ending a fight, he said, is to make the cost high enough that the other party decides to stop. You hurt them badly enough. You threaten them seriously enough. You make the situation sufficiently unfavorable that their rational self-preservation response kicks in, and they withdraw. He paused. That method assumes that the other party has a rational self-preservation response that will kick in at some point. Another pause. Humans have something else. They have a word for it, a small word, 1 syllable, and it is the most dangerous thing I have ever encountered in 14 years of active service. Waited. The word, he said, is no. He let it sit. Not no as a negotiating position, he said. Not no as a temporary response that becomes yes when the pressure is high enough. No as a terminal state. No as the complete and final end of the conversation, backed by the full commitment of a species that spent hundreds of thousands of years learning that the thing standing between them and survival was something they were going to have to go through, not around. He looked at the front row. When a human says no, they do not mean they would prefer a different outcome. They mean the conversation is over, and what comes next is not a conversation. The hall was the quietest it had been. I watched a human take a pulse blade wound and turn it into a grip. I watched her break 6 armed fighters in 11 seconds, while bleeding from a wound that would have ended the engagement for most HFY warriors. And then I watched her call for a cleanup crew before she called for a medic, because her professional obligation was more immediate to her than her own injury. He looked at the room. She was not exceptional. I have confirmed this across 8 years of service. She was trained, and she was experienced, and she was good at her job. But what she did in that corridor was not unusual for a human under pressure. It was human under pressure. That is what it looks like. That is the species we have been calling Tier 6 prey for 200 years. He stepped back from the speaker's position. Study them, he said. Not because they are your enemies. Most of them are not. And working alongside them is one of the more useful things a HFY officer can do with a posting. But because understanding what they are is part of understanding what the galaxy actually contains, as opposed to what the Codex has been comfortable telling us for the last 2 centuries. He picked up his notes. And if you ever find yourself in a corridor with one who is bleeding and has not stopped, do not make the mistake of thinking the bleeding is a sign that you are winning. He walked out of the hall. Behind him, 300 cadets sat in silence for a long time before anyone said anything at all. And the first one who did speak did not say anything clever, or funny, or dismissive. They said, I want to read Ovaleth's full report, which was, Skethra would have said if he had heard it, exactly the right place to start.